On the streets of Santa Cruz, California, he walked along the edge of the dirt road, his tired eyes searching for a car to stop and take him somewhere far from his harsh reality. He felt the cold breeze from the Pacific Ocean sting his face as his feet moved slowly on the road, empty except for the wind and fallen leaves. It was just another day in a life filled with loneliness and hunger. Suddenly, an old car stopped beside him, its window half open, and the driver looked at him with expressionless eyes. The driver gave him a silent invitation and opened the front door. Whitey approached the car and smiled faintly, ready to get in and escape that desolate road. But before they could set off, the driver's expression suddenly changed and his face tightened as if he were listening to a voice from another world. The driver, Herbert Mullin, heard a strange voice echoing deep in his head, a voice he couldn't ignore. "Kill him so others can survive." The voice repeated this phrase as if it were urgent pleas, and he had no choice but to obey. Herbert felt a rising anger flow through his body, like an uncontrollable energy. That moment was like a spark that ignited a fire within him that wouldn't go out. Without warning, Herbert reached into the back seat and grabbed a baseball bat that was there. In an instant, everything changed. The roads, trees, and ocean disappeared around him, leaving only Whitey in front of him, a target for his overwhelming rage. Herbert raised the bat high and then brought it down forcefully on Whitey's head. Whitey let out a short scream, cut off by the sound of bones hitting wood, ending his life instantly and turning the moment into a strange silence that filled the car and the road around them. This was the first crime in a series of 13 murders committed by Herbert Mullin, who later became known as the Hippie Killer, over a period of just 4 months. His crimes were like a relentless storm, leaving behind victims who didn't know why they were killed. Herbert Mullin was convinced that he was chosen to carry out a bloody mission to save California from a new earthquake. So, what is the story of this killer, and why did he kill all these people in such a short time? This is what we will learn in our story today from your channel, Dahaliz, where we always uncover the most complex crimes and mysteries. Herbert Mullin, born on April 18, 1947, in Salinas, California, was born on a date of great significance to him and would later become a major part of his obsession: the devastating San Francisco earthquake that occurred in 1906. That earthquake, with a magnitude of 7.9 on the Richter scale, shook the city violently and resulted in the deaths of at least 100,000 people. This event remained etched in his memory, as if it were a sign of what his role in life should be. Herbert's childhood was not a happy one. It was filled with trauma and conflicts. His father, a World War II hero, was a strict and domineering man who boasted of his achievements on the front lines and taught his son a love for weapons and strength. But there was no real love between father and son. There were only orders and constant pressures that left Herbert with no room to breathe. Despite this, the child was exceptionally sensitive and remarkably intelligent, so much so that his teachers at school described him as someone who would achieve great success among his peers. But life, with its traumas and mysteries, had something else in store for him. After leaving school, Herbert experienced a severe shock when he lost his best friend, Dan Richardson, in a tragic car accident. This was a pivotal moment in his life, a moment after which Herbert was never the same. He felt a deep void permeate his heart and became immersed in grief and sorrow to the point that it drove him to do strange and disturbing things. He began building a small shrine in his home in honor of his late friend and spent long hours meditating in front of his picture as if trying to communicate with him. Herbert became interested in the idea of reincarnation, believing that his friend's spirit could somehow return to life. He was obsessed with natural disasters, especially the earthquakes that threatened California. In addition, Herbert became addicted to various drugs, which further deteriorated his mental state and pushed him toward the brink of madness. This disturbed state and the hallucinations that began to haunt him eventually led him to a mental hospital in 1969. There, he began to believe that he was the only one who could save the state from the impending earthquake by sacrificing humans. These dark thoughts took control of him, and made him live in a world different from the one around him. His parents were the first to notice the signs of mental imbalance in Herbert Mullin. They watched with increasing concern as he transformed into a strange person, especially when he began to insist that he heard voices in his head and developed different personalities as if escaping from his reality. Sometimes he convinced himself that he was a professional boxer. At other times, he embodied the character of a Mexican citizen or a spiritual guru with secrets of life, or even a hippie wandering without a specific destination. These personalities were in conflict within him and took part of his true identity, which began to fade little by little. These identity changes were not the only things that worried his family. His behavior became increasingly strange and extreme. In moments of loss of control, he would extinguish cigarettes on his skin, and physical pain was the only way to silence the annoying voices in his head. At other times, he would punch the wall with his fist until his bones cracked, saying he was trying to destroy an evil person he imagined in front of him. These self-destructive behaviors indicated something much deeper than just a passing mental disorder. After many attempts to enter and leave mental hospitals, professional doctors issued a clear diagnosis of Herbert Mullin's condition: paranoid schizophrenia. This diagnosis was not just passing words. It was a confirmation that Herbert was a dangerous individual to himself and society. Renowned analysts at the FBI, such as Robert Ressler, emphasized that Herbert should be handled with extreme caution, as he was a ticking time bomb waiting for the right moment to explode. However, no specialist suggested permanent medical supervision for Herbert or any medication that could help calm the madness growing inside him. Among these insane states was that strange prophecy that completely possessed Herbert, the prophecy of the devastating earthquake that was supposed to hit Northern California in early 1973, according to the predictions of mathematician Robin Reespan. This prophecy was like a flame he couldn't ignore. Herbert's crime wave began on October 13, 1972, and didn't stop until February 13, 1973. In just 4 months, 13 innocent victims lost their lives at his hands. The first victim was the homeless Lawrence White, known as Whitey, a 55-year-old man who was just looking for a ride on the road, but ended up a victim of Herbert Mullin after the latter heard a voice in his head commanding him to kill. Herbert grabbed a baseball bat and mercilessly struck Whitey, leaving his lifeless body by the roadside. This crime didn't receive much attention from the authorities, allowing him to return to the path of killing after a few days. The next victim was Mary Guilfoyle, a 24-year-old woman on her way to a job interview. Herbert stopped to offer her a ride, but she didn't know it was a ride to death. He brutally stabbed her, then dismembered her body and scattered her remains among the roadside bushes. Her body wasn't found until long after his arrest. On November 2nd, he committed his third crime. This time, the victim was Father Henry Tomei, a 65-year-old priest who was preparing to hear confessions in his quiet church when Herbert ambushed him and beat and stabbed him mercilessly. The priest died hiding behind the church curtains, trying to escape the horror of that moment. After that crime, Herbert tried to escape reality in a different way. He attempted to join the army, believing it would help him continue his mission with access to weapons, but the army rejected him due to his history of drug addiction, which increased his frustration. He had no choice but to buy a gun himself, and his target was revenge on those he believed were part of his problems. On January 25, 1973, his new targets were Jim Johnera, an old schoolmate and drug dealer who sold him drugs during his addiction period, and Jim's wife, Joan. When Herbert arrived at the couple's home, he shot them and then excessively stabbed them, wanting to ensure that all his pain and anger had disappeared with their lives. But this wasn't enough to satisfy his rage. Before reaching their home, he had committed another massacre no less brutal, killing Kathy Francis, Joan's best friend, along with her 2 children. 15 days later, he committed another murder, but it was larger than the previous ones. In Henry Cowell State Park, he killed 4 young men who were camping quietly under the giant forest trees. The victims were David Oliker and Robert Spector, both 18 years old, Brian Card, 19 years old, and Mark Dreibelbis, 15 years old. He killed them one by one and left their bodies there, where they weren't discovered until a week later. As decomposition began to set in, each crime added a new chapter to the story of madness and mystery crafted by Herbert Mullin. He didn't see himself as a killer, but believed he was a savior, the man with the power to save the state from an impending disaster. He was a victim of the voices and internal struggles and the terror that had haunted him since childhood. His story was a painful reminder that madness can sometimes take on a heroic form in the eyes of its beholder, but in reality, it leaves only destruction behind. On February 13th, the last crime in the series of the Hippie killer occurred, and the scene was as grim as usual. Herbert Mullin was driving through quiet neighborhoods when he spotted an elderly man, Fred Perez, 72 years old, mowing the lawn in his yard peacefully, as if life flowed smoothly in that place. Herbert's car stopped suddenly, and without a word, he pulled out a gun from under the seat, lowered the passenger window slowly, and in a moment, the bullet was fired towards Perez's chest, ending it all in seconds. It was as if all life had vanished in a single sound. When Herbert tried to flee the crime scene, he didn't know that a neighbor had witnessed everything from his window, recorded the car's license plate number with a trembling hand, and rushed to call the police. Within minutes, a police patrol intercepted Herbert, who stopped calmly and raised his hands without any resistance. He had no desire to escape. Perhaps part of him longed for that moment. During his initial statement at the authorities' center, he spoke in horrifying detail about the murder of Fred Perez, as if it were a story memorized in his head, recounting it without hesitation. Perez wasn't the only victim. Herbert Mullin confessed to committing 12 other murders in recent months, all under the direction of the voices that commanded him to kill to prevent impending earthquakes. He spoke of those voices as if they were real, as if they were part of a reality that no one else could see. Meanwhile, forensic teams were searching his apartment for any evidence that could incriminate him. Inside, the rooms were filled with symbols, like a laboratory of a man trying to understand the world in his own way. There was a Bible on the table next to a copy of the life and times of Albert Einstein, reflecting his search for a deeper understanding of existence. Investigators also found an address book containing the address of drug dealer Jim Johnera, and numerous newspaper articles about the killing spree. In his truck, police found the weapons he used to commit his crimes, as if they were witnesses to the atrocities Herbert had committed. But the most striking thing was a handwritten memo, like a message to the entire world. In this memo, Mullin wrote to inform all the inhabitants of the earth that this document had more power than any document before it. The tragedy that occurred should not have happened, and through this act of his free will, it could happen again as long as he could stay here and protect his lineage. These words reflected his strange obsession with his sense of responsibility, as if his crimes were a sacred duty to protect others. In July 1973, the trial of the Hippie killer began. Herbert Mullin stood on the witness stand, and it was clear he had no fear of confessing. He spoke frankly about the voices he heard, those voices that told him he had to kill to prevent a catastrophic earthquake. In his testimony, he insisted that the victims were asking him to kill them through some form of communication. It didn't end there. Herbert accused his family of being part of a conspiracy to prevent his sexual development since his teenage years. He spoke of it as if it were a case that represented an important part of his life that no one else understood. These accusations made the picture more complicated and showed Herbert as a person drowning in perceptions and madness that couldn't be explained. From that moment, the trial focused on determining Herbert Mullin's criminal responsibility. The central question was whether he was in full mental capacity when committing these horrific acts. The prosecution presented sufficient evidence to refute Herbert's criminal irresponsibility, asserting that the crimes were planned well in advance, indicating that Herbert was sane when committing them. Additionally, Herbert left a clear record showing he felt no remorse after committing these brutal crimes, as argued strongly by District Attorney Jeff Rozelle in court. However, The defense attorney tried to present a different angle, standing before the jury and saying, "Make no mistake, Mr. Mullin hears voices in his head, and these voices told him to kill. The actions he committed were not murders, but acts of sacrifice," attempting to present his client as a victim of a mental illness that drove him down a path he couldn't control. In August, the jury announced that Herbert Mullin was guilty of 10 of his 13 crimes. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder in Santa Cruz County, and 9 sentences of 5 years to life for second-degree murder in Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties. Over nearly 50 years, Herbert Mullin filed up to 11 requests for parole, but the parole board always rejected them, citing the severity of his mental state and his lack of recovery from his destructive thoughts. The last time he applied was in 2021, with the possibility of filing a new appeal in 2025. However, he never did, as he died on August 18, 2022, at the age of 75, ending a long chapter of terror in Santa Cruz's history. So, dear viewers, what do you think? Was Herbert truly insane, hearing thoughts and hallucinations that made him kill innocent people? Or was he a cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what he was doing? Let us know your opinions in the comments below. And don't forget to support us with a like and subscribe to the channel to receive all the latest updates.